Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jeff Mullen. I'm the acting chair of the hearing for a comprehensive permit for 582 Blue Hill Avenue. This is the 21st public hearing, session of the public hearing that started in December. With me is Frank O'Brien and Giselle Joffer, both members of the board. Welcome. This hearing is being recorded. Tonight, we'll be hearing, we had been proposed to hear from the town's Department of Public Works. They've asked for a 1-week extension. They want to speak to the town's peer reviewer, Mr. Reardon, who's with us tonight. I've permitted them to do that, so we will not hear from them tonight. We will hear from them next week, July 14th. So that's point one. Point two, it's customary that I announce to people what we got over the weekend. I don't believe we got any material, although I could be wrong on that, but nothing comes to mind. To the extent that we did get material, it's been posted on the website. We're also going to hear from this planning board tonight, a representative of the planning board. I don't see Mr. Zawinski here, although perhaps he is here. And to the extent he's here, I'm going to initially begin the hearing by hearing from the planning board. As they'd requested. Fourthly, at the last hearing, Mr. Schomer indicated that he was going to speak to us about a few of the smaller items, some of which were raised by Ms. Joffer in a previous hearing, many of which Mr. Schomer listed last meeting. And we're welcome to hear from him verbally, or if you prefer in writing, whatever is the pleasure, but I want to address that. And then lastly, offer Mr. Schomer an opportunity to react to Mr. Hill's testimony on behalf of the Vos Hill Neighborhood Association from last week. Looking ahead, we'll need to hear from the DPW director and other public officials to the extent that they want to testify, and perhaps we'll have more conversation about the on and off-site infrastructure. And we'll talk about the town waivers, and then hopefully we'll begin to bring this hearing to a conclusion. So that's a little bit of a roadmap of what I see. Mr. Zawinski, are you, is planning board prepared to speak?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'll let you continue. I just want to let you know that I'm here.
Okay. Is the planning board here?
So in the participants or the participants.
Yeah, Tim, I need your
Yep.
help.
So Cheryl Tagayas and Wynn Swenson. Wynn Swenson is actually Denny Swenson, who's the chair of the planning board.
Yep.
I'll set them.
Okay, so we're gonna hear first from them, but before we hear from them, let me ask members of the board if they've got anything they'd like to add to my introductory remarks.
Nothing here, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Ms. Joffer? Okay, we can hear from her later if she would like. Let me ask Mr. Schomer if he's got a response to the introductory comments.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Nothing further from me at this time. We do anticipate filing some supplemental materials, as I mentioned last week, specifically on the issue of site accessibility, pedestrian flow, bicycle storage, garbage access, and I believe that's the sum and substance of it. But that'll be coming later this week. So if it pleases the board, I would prefer to save comment until after we've filed the plans with you and you've had an opportunity to review them.
So we'll hear from you on that next week?
If that's acceptable.
That's acceptable. So it could be that we've got a relatively abbreviated hearing tonight. At the end of this hearing, I'm gonna make some remarks about giving you a little bit of feedback about at least what's on my mind, and invite the board to do the same for the next hearing. But let me ask Ms. Swenson. Let me welcome her to the Board of Appeals. Thank you for participating in the hearing and for the work that you do on behalf of the town. And we're happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Chair Mullen, and thank you, zoning board members, for inviting the planning board to participate in your discussion. This project has been a bit of a moving target from my observation, so I can only imagine the challenges for all of you in tracking the many moving details. As many of you know, the planning board is a deliberative board that considers impacts on long-term planning. Like your board, we do have projects that come before us, and our goal is to steer those projects in the most positive direction we can. So wherever we are in a process, it's all about trying to make it better for the site, the community, and for the town of Milton. Many of the 2 planning board letters our board has already submitted would still apply to the latest round of updates that I've had the ability to look at. And once the updates are at a standstill, in other words, they don't have to be complete, just in a non-moving state long enough for our board to get it on an agenda and discuss, we'll provide a new letter with further detail. But I am grateful to join you tonight to talk about some of our overarching concerns. In the planning board's letter dated January 19th to the select board, our first point was that the project is not generally appropriate. The Ellen Biddle Shipman's House and Gardens, as it currently exists, we believe is the best use for this site. The historic documents about this incredible female landscape architect of her day, provided by Meredith Hall of the Historic Commission, and now she's a planning board member, demonstrated the incredible historical value of the house and the landscape. Mass Housing's design criteria include the requirements that the quote conceptual project design is generally appropriate for the site, taking into consideration integration into the existing development patterns. So the planning board still feels the proposed 40B height, size, and footprint is a serious concern. It is too massive for the site and fails to properly integrate the proposed buildings with the surrounding area. There are no comparable size projects in the entire town. We do have some dense developments in town that work, and the reason that I believe they work is because there's enough open space around them so that the density is sort of in the middle of the site, and the open space around the density creates a healthy buffer for those that live in the development. And the positive use of this open space has proven to help these new communities to blend into the broader community around them. For example, if you take a look at Fuller Village, Home Inc., Winter Valley, and even 88 Wharf, the residents of these developments now all benefit from the thoughtful planning and the use of space and land topography. Affordable housing can be good, and it can be done well with some thoughtful planning. Thoughtful development here could also be profitable. The planning board letter submitted to the select board on January 19th stated that this project is not in compliance with sustainability principles, with the sustainable development principles. It fails to meet the requirement to concentrate development and mixed uses. Most of the site will be covered with massive buildings, driveways, and parking lots, and the garden will not likely have enough sun to survive. The project is not near service or shops. The project fails to protect land and ecosystem. The applicant states that it will not build within 100 feet of a wetland, but it says nothing about the removal of substantial trees surrounding the property and shielding it from abutters. There is no transportation choice at this proposed site. It is too far from the bus and transit lines. The applicant admits the project does not promote clean energy or use sustainable resources. The project is not consistent with Plan Regionally, as it does not in any way meet the expectations and goals of the town's master plan, and will in fact exacerbate the serious traffic issues on Blue Hill Avenue. And on March 12th, the planning board wrote a letter to Zoning Board of Appeals Chair Mullen, stating our concerns about the viability of the historic gardens, asking for a shadow study and suggesting an alternative that shows the west building closer to and more aligned with Blue Hill Avenue. In summation, our planning board has been and continues to be unanimously opposed to the overly aggressive 40B on this site. As a planning board, we take the stormwater issues very seriously, and it seems the site cannot handle the proposed density without a detrimental impact on the site and surrounding the site. You have impressive expert testimony on that. Again, it brings up the issue that the density and the footprint of bringing that size down would help on the stormwater and engineering issues. My fellow planning board member, Cheryl Tagayas, and I, who will be speaking after me, I hope, we are both on a committee assessing grade and fill impacts and how to limit those impacts with stronger rules and guidelines, because we've seen many issues where sites have been aggressively clear-cut, leveled with grade and fill work done, and then extensive retaining walls were installed. We've seen the negative impacts and the difficulty in actually healing the site after this sort of work is done. Applicants have come before us, shown us nice drawings of how it will work, but during the process and after construction is all done, we go to the site and it's a disaster. A costly disaster that's left to the homeowners association or to the town to clean up for years to come. This aggressive proposal, this 40B proposal, reminds me of these sites, but tenfold, because of the sheer density and aggressive nature of not working with the topography and working with what is already there. The ideal projects that come before us work with what's there and try to honor it and try to honor what's around it. While I still have you, I have a couple thoughts on the landscape plan. I noticed bearberry plants and Norway spruce listed on the landscape plan. On my list, those are listed as invasive. Sweet gum trees can become invasive. There are efforts all over town to remove invasive plants as they spread to other properties and cause damage to other productive plants and trees that are beneficial. I also noticed American elm on the landscape plan list. I'm hearing that those are not recommended right now because of disease in the area. These trees are dealing with the disease. On the planning board, we often call on the shade tree committee and we seek their advice and require that the developer work out a list that with the shade tree committee, because they've provide very thoughtful plans that work with the town's overarching ecosystem goals. So that's one of the conditions that I would be, if it was before our board, I would be looking for. Also, native species are always better for the environment. So a more overarching issue is if an applicant wants to put a large building, like say 54 feet or something, one way to do a large dense building is to put in some trees equal in height along the buffer. But when I'm looking at this landscape plan, I don't see room for trees that large because of the stormwater cement structures close to the buffer area. So putting in small trees and shrubs along the abutter line is not really a buffer. So from a planning perspective, this doesn't work because of the unit count and height. So less density would mean less storm water. So if you brought the density down, you'd have more of an area. If you brought the height down, you don't have to have the trees go quite as tall. So it's kind of like, if you bring the height down, bring the density down, make room for the trees, you can heal the site much more effectively. I thought the economic assessment request from a few meetings ago was an interesting point. The developer is going to make a profit off of this property once you get over a couple of additional units, just because of the way the market is right now. So in my mind, sustainable, affordable housing is what we should all be aiming for here. If you can have a developed site that can hail afterward with healthy trees, those trees will help keep the homes cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter, with less energy costs. Studies have shown that people who can look out their window and see trees heal faster than from ailments than others do. There's studies out there that show the benefits to education levels and so forth, testing and so forth, for children. But generally speaking, a balance of sun and shade, and the outdoor play areas and recreational areas, even the parking lots, can help keep people and cars to a more comfortable temperature. So on the sides and backs of the site, the landscape drawing shows a neat little line of trees for the screening of neighbors, but it would seem to make sense to plant a staggered combination of very tall trees, if you're talking about tall buildings, and mid-sized trees, so you have a buffer of all heights, and even maybe some small shrubs. That would be a real buffer. So I would also consider trees and shrubs that are heavy drinkers to assist with water absorption on the site. This is something that the Shade Tree Committee would be wonderfully helpful on. Of course, some thought and planning would need to go into the impact of any trees on the gardens that you're also trying to protect here. Trees, shrubs, and ground cover can absorb up to 30% of the water that lands on a site if planned thoughtfully, which brings me to the construction management plan. A construction management plan is something that we work on all the time with special permits. And on a site like this, it would be important to obtain an arborist certified inventory of the trees on the site before any activity occurs. Then it would be important to determine what trees need to be removed for health and safety, and which ones would need to be removed for foundations, utility installation, and other structures. Then you'll be left with a list and a map of existing trees. And Cheryl we could speak on this for hours, but the ideal thing is to keep as many of those trees that are safe to keep on the site. So in the construction management plan, we would generally have conditions, tree protections, that would need to be listed out for management during and after construction. So the planning board, for instance, requires that the drip line for these trees would need to be fenced. Subcontractors would need to be informed through signage and written notice not to put equipment or materials on the drip line of the trees or plants that are to be protected. Otherwise, the trees suffocate. And sometimes it might take years for them to die. So they're suffocated during construction for a year or two, developer leaves, and then trees start falling down. Cheryl and I have been through that. Our board has been through that a couple of times. We've had huge, beautiful trees fall after developers have, left because they were slowly killed by the suffocation of having their roots driven over repeatedly by heavy equipment or bobcats, or parked on, or having piles of rock or dirt or pipes or concrete left on top of the root systems, preventing air and water from getting to the root systems for the tree or plant survival. So required fencing of the drip line and arborist monitoring has worked on other sites, and that's something that I would like to discuss in a construction management plan. And those are the kind of conditions that the planning board would recommend. The other thing is we've seen on too many construction sites that if there's a period of time during construction where open or graded land is left wide open, invasive plants move in, and they don't absorb the water like the native trees and plants do. They just kind of take up the space, but they don't do the beneficial acts that well-planned plants and trees do. I have a site visit on another site where they're having a terrible time because they stripped the land, didn't plant it for a year, and now it's covered with invasives that are taller than me that just grew in like the last 7 months. And removal is really hard because we did plant some trees in there that we'd like to keep. So poison is out of the question. So timely plantings and the monitoring of and addressing invasive plants during construction would also be conditions that I would be looking at. it's really about being a good neighbor too, because these invasives do jump to abutting properties and they kind of run through neighborhoods. So we've also had flooding on other sites after extensive grading and clearing was done. So the healing of any graded land with plantings is key to success. It's good for the residents of the new development too. It's good for the new residents who live there to have a healthy buffer too. Everyone benefits from that. So I know you've had trouble getting a construction management plan, but I just want to stress that part of design is walking through a construction management plan to see how it will actually get created. So if there's no resolution to obvious issues, then you'd have to make adjustments to the site plan. So for example, if you do the standard tree protections and landscape protections of fencing the drip line, and there's no space for construction equipment or construction material movement on the site, the density is too much. So where are they going to store their materials? How are they going to move on the site during construction? How are safety vehicles like fire trucks going to be able to enter and exit the site if they need to during construction? So on this site, the placement of the stormwater system probably leaves no room to plant large trees to buffer or to heal the site anywhere near the height of the buildings along the abutter line. So that tells you the width of the building is too wide. There's no room for tree width. And that tells you the buildings are too tall because you can't fit trees tall enough. So if you bring the density down, you can bring the tree size down, and you can find, that sweet spot where it could work. So when I think about the site plan in relation to healing the site after construction with trees and landscape, I see the footprint is too large to make this a workable and sustainable site. When I try to walk through the construction management, safety, and sustainability, I see once again that the footprint is too large to make this a workable or sustainable site. When you look at the stormwater engineering issues, I see once again, the footprint is just too large to make this workable or sustainable. So, and my last point, I promise, on the planning board, when I have an applicant before us asking for multiple waivers, in your case, variances, during that site plan approval, I ask, where is the hardship? Generally, there isn't really a hardship, it's a cost saving. The developer simply wants to cut corners to save money. So I also ask, where is the public benefit in granting, where is the public good in granting this waiver that's before us? So we all know there is a good in affordable housing. That is a public good. In this case, that public good of affordable housing can be balanced with the goal of creating housing that serves those who are in need of affordable housing, not simply the corner cutting goals of the developers. It can't only be about the developer's pocketbook. The developers are going to make money on this project. If they put a house or two on this project, they would get their money back and more. But if the developer is going to walk away whole, and the developer is going to walk away with a profit. So we, the planning board, oppose this aggressive proposal. If legally this has got to go forward as affordable housing, then the key goal in my mind is to find that sweet spot for a footprint and density that will make this the best that it can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Swenson.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time and thoughtfulness. Let me ask the members of the board if they've got any questions for Chairwoman Swenson. Ms. Joffer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Swenson, thank you very much for your presentation. And it's very helpful to hear a little bit about your process at the planning board level. With respect to the construction management plan, I think you're the first person who's spoken about it with respect to trees and landscaping, and that was interesting to me. And I wondered if you could comment on potentially whether you think there's additional need for a construction management plan because of the historical gardens specifically.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as I said, developers, applicants come before me all the time, and they have these drawings and they have these plans. It's very important to walk through how you get there, because you can say, oh, this will be fine, that will be fine, but how will it be fine? What are the protection measures you're going to invest in? And it's important to get those up front, because after various approvals go and the machine just takes off, it's hard when you have things and agreements in writing at the beginning. If you don't have agreements in writing at the beginning, it's impossible to enforce. So we have a construction management plan before we grant any special permits, before they can put a shovel in the ground. And I think developers like to put it off as long as they can. But as I said, if you can't do it, then we shouldn't approve it. If you can't actually do the work, if you can't fit the materials on the site, or you can't turn a fire truck around, or all the things that I've listed, and do it while you're protecting the resources that need to be protected, that you've said you're going to protect, then you need to change the site plan. So let's get the site plan straight up front. And part of doing that is walking all the way through a construction management plan, in my opinion. Thank you for your question. I hope I answered it.
You did, and you actually predicted my second question, which was going to be related to the timing of the construction management plan and whether it would be sufficient to get it after considering the waivers.
I would have trouble granting any waivers until I had that construction management plan in my hands, because I need to verify if there really is a public good. And I would need to understand, cost savings to a point. I mean, they are doing affordable housing, but they're asking for a lot of variances. And I mean, a lot of variances. This is more than I've ever seen on any other project that I can recall. And I've been on the planning board for over 4 years. So I think there is a public good in affordable housing, but you have to balance that with everything else. So I think it's overreach to not have a construction management plan at this stage. I was actually surprised to hear you're having difficulty getting a construction management plan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Swenson.
Thank you very much.
And Mr. Chair, just for the record, and slightly off topic, I just wanted to note that I did hear you reference me earlier, and I was having difficulty technologically chiming in. So just wanted you to know that I was here in attendance, and quorum remained.
We never doubted. We never doubted it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. O'Brien.
No questions at this time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Swenson, thank you very much. Is Mr. Tagayas wish to be recognized?
Yes, it would be Ms. Cheryl Tagayas. I hope she's here this evening.
There she is.
I am, Denny. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Chair Mullen, members of the board, and thank you to our planning board chair, Denny Swenson, for her comprehensive comments. I do just want to add a few to help some of the things that we were thinking about and talking about with respect to the intensity of the development, but also in the spirit of trying to make projects better. I'll have a few suggestions as well. And one, I'm an architect. I've been a practicing architect for over 30 years. I've been on the planning board for 6. I was on the master plan committee before that, and on the warrant committee before that. So I've been involved in zoning initiatives and reviewing projects in Milton now for some time. On the intensity of the development, one of the things that is a sure sign to me for concern is when the project requires retaining walls nearly entirely around the site. And looking at the most recent engineering plans, that's what I see. I see retaining walls all across the east, wrapping around the south and up the west, and even in part on the north, although not quite as high. And what these retaining walls indicate is a significant amount of earth, either removal or addition. So in the case of the northwest, there's some cut. It may not be as significant as there is on the fill side. The fill side, which is entirely across the east and south of the property to make way for the road, the access roadway that goes around, requires 10 to 12 feet of fill. That's a lot of fill. We would be looking at that really carefully and seriously if that came before the planning board in such a design. That kind of retaining wall is also going to necessitate a guardrail, in my view. So if you have a guardrail, that's going to wrap around the entire southern portion of this. And that's what the Meeting House Lane neighbors are going to see. They're going to see a lot of new earth, which will kill trees, as Denny's talked about. They're going to see a retaining wall and a guardrail. And it's going to look a lot different than what they see today. I don't think it's necessary to do this level of intensity, this level of footprint. The size of this footprint is really dictating, as Denny said, this level of intensity. So when I looked at this, and I saw that, sorry, my technology with the thunderstorm had me drop out for a second. But when I looked at this, I said, okay, what's driving that footprint? So as an architect, I can look at these plans and understand them. And I said, well, you know, it's the length of this building on the east, really. And if that building were shorter, both at the north and at the south, it would allow the roadway to move further away from Meeting House Lane. It might still need some of the retaining wall, but you have more earth, you have more land area to work with to actually slope the land up to the retaining wall so it's not so abrupt. And the conditions on the east are a little more challenging because of the proximity of the development to the property line. But if it can make a difference on the Meeting House roadside, I think that would be a substantial improvement for the residents who live on Meeting House Lane. And by making that footprint smaller and looking at it on the northern section, you would address another concern, which is that these new buildings are actually dwarfing the historic home and historic gardens. I applaud the development team for currently now proposing to keep them, to keep the gardens in the existing house. But if they made the building, the eastern building, not as forward towards Blue Hill Avenue, I think that would help substantially in the dwarfing of the existing home. So if you reduce the footprint on the southerly side and on the northerly side, it would make a big difference in the way this project impacts onto this site, so the intensity of development. And again, looking at the plans, you could lose 4 units on the north and take away that section, and that would bring you that building back. And on the southern side, if you took the new building footprint back to where the garden wall is, you would lose 10 units. So you would be looking at a loss of 14 units on a which is not a large number considering the intensity of use of this site. Then you would lose 10 parking spaces. And I believe that this the scale of development is somewhat consistent with what the peer reviewer Cliff Bomer has been talking about in terms of this project not yet being there yet in terms of what it can do with design. So I would encourage you to before you make a decision about the level of intensity of this development, that you consider these comments. And one last comment I'd like to make has to do with something that seems to be a detail, but again, it goes to the intensity of the use of the site. And that is the snow storage areas that are called out for on the engineering plans. They're very small. One is located right at the front door, right next to the turnaround. And then 2 of them are located right next to the garden walls on the south side. The thing about the piling the snow from a roadway in such small areas is, how is that going to be when it melts and how it melts, and what's it going to do in terms of your perception of the front of the building? So those conclude my comments. Hopefully, I support everything else actually, and the board does everything else that Jenny mentioned before me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gaius. Appreciate the efforts of the planning board. Members, questions for Mr. Gaius? Sure, Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Want to go back to your comment. This is for both Mr. Gaius, sorry, and Ms. Swenson. And both of you had mentioned basically you view the construction of retaining walls of significant size and significant area as a blinking warning light. In the experience of the planning board, has the planning board dealt with a project that proposes to put in place retaining walls of this size and this scale? Is there something that you've seen in the past and perhaps considered, and what was the fate of that particular proposal?
That's a great question. I am jogging my memory. I'm going to check with Cheryl. Cheryl's been on a little bit longer, but 12 feet high, I think that wins the prize as the largest. Cheryl, would you think so?
I would. You know why? The planning board doesn't generally see a development that so exceeds what the zoning would allow. So we have written zoning, and as Denny mentioned, we're working on revisions to zoning and rules and regs related to this, because what we found is with change of grade, significant change of grade, particularly close to property lines, that it does have impacts on the budding properties that may not be apparent initially. Like, for example, Denny talked about trees. Well, oftentimes trees are located right on property lines. And so if you're doing regrading or retaining walls close to those property lines, you're affecting the trees of the neighboring properties. And you're removing potentially large trees that could be nice buffers to the adjacent properties. Recognizing that the 40B development is going to be larger than adjacent properties, it's really important to have buffers. And you can't rely on the neighbors' properties to provide the buffers. I mean, this is something that the planning board doesn't see as frequently, because we don't see such extensive requests for waivers. We work with the applicants on the best way to achieve their developments with grading that, and we obviously understand that with change of topography on properties, it may be necessary to have retaining walls and regrading, but we think that a development can be more sensitive to the existing conditions on the site than what we see here.
Yeah. So in my recollection, the Carberry Walcott, there was some grading. There was some stone walls, retaining walls, nothing like this. Pulte had some retaining walls. That was before my time, but I don't think they had 12 feet. Do you, Cheryl?
I don't recall 12 feet, no.
No, and like I'm kind of walking through like Fuller Village or Winter Valley, they seem to work with the topography. In my assessment of those properties, now those were before my time, we are not used to seeing 12 feet high retaining walls. That's sort of an alien to us. That's just not a good site plan. It's just ripe with issues.
In a similar vein, you also seem to indicate concerns with one other area of the site, which would require a significant level of fill. I take it that you would have analogous concerns with a significant level of fill or some significant volume of fill such as proposed here that you would have with the retaining walls as well.
Yes, I'm sure Cheryl will add to this, but the reason Phil will kill all the plant life or trees or root systems. And like I said, those plants and trees during construction could be drinking a portion of the water that could be helpful. And you know, you take down trees that are 50, 100 years old, you can plant new trees, but you're not going to have them similar to the trees that you remove for 50 or 100 years. So it's a big loss on a site. It's not the ideal way. I shouldn't, it's not a good way to do it. And then you have a lot of stormwater issues in my experience on the sites that I've seen that involved a lot of cutting and filling. Like Cheryl said, we try our best to steer away from that approach. There are times where we say for safety, we'll let you do it here, but we're not going to go along with other parts of the site, but you can do it here a little bit for these reasons. You're going to be installing something there anyway, blah, blah, blah. So we work with the developers, but this is a huge ask.
I'd like to add that, you know, building height is often referenced off of finished grade. So when you're looking at a building that's called out to be 35 or 45 or 55 feet tall off of finished grade, now you need to add another 10 or 12 feet to what is existing grade is. So instead of a 55-foot high building, you're looking at a 67-foot high building, for example, for the neighbor that's sitting down gradient from that property. I'm thinking of Meeting House Lane. And, you know, it's a waiver because the way we measure height, as I'm sure you all know, you know, in Milton has to do with the existing grade, not with the proposed grades, and takes it on an average. So that's another concern about the fill, is what it does in terms of where it places the first floor and the total height of the building.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. No further questions at this time.
Ms. Joffer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Ms. Tagayas. I think you're the first person to mention the guardrail. And so is that a part of the design, or is that something that you think will be necessary that's not a part of the existing design?
I guess I'm suggesting it should be asked of the engineers.
Okay.
Because when your roadway is that high elevated above the grade below it, if you think about just your own experiences on driving on roadways, there'll be a guardrail in case that someone was to veer off of that roadway, right? So given these heights and the amount of fill, my suggestion is to ask the engineer about that. It is a concern.
Thank you.
Had that, so Denny may recall too, this is something the planning board addressed on the Wolcott Woods special permit, because there are sections there that do have guardrails, and we talked about the design of those guardrails, the relationship of those to the edge of the road, was there landscaping or sidewalk next to them? So there was a lot of discussion about how to make those integrated better into development.
As I recall, didn't we suggest plantings on the other side of the guardrails? But in this case, would that be on someone else's property?
It's something that I think that there should be some further discussion and information provided, for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. The other thing you said, Ms. Tagayas, that sparked my interest was something like the neighbors will see more soil or more earth. So do you fear that despite the walls, there will still be erosion?
Well, what I fear is in looking at the grading plan in the most recent set of engineering drawings, the regrading is right up to the property line on the, I guess, the southeast corner. So that abutter will have, there's going to be, I mean, I see Mr. Reardon's here and he's the stormwater expert rather than me, but just from common sense point of view, when you have a slope there will be water coming off the slope, even though the roadway itself, I'm sure it has to be designed to drain itself. But you're basically bringing in a lot of fill very close to the neighboring properties. Generally, you're required not to have any impact on that adjacent property, which might mean you'd have to put in some kind of swale to move, any water coming off that around to someplace else. And that the plans that you have, like on the landscape plan, might get into more fine grading than an engineer's grading plan would, but you don't have any kind of grading on your landscape plans. So there's a lot more detail, like when determining how this design is going to really look. When you look at, I looked at the three-dimensional representations, and you can see in the distance there's some tall trees and very big trees, an incline of earth and a wall that looks pretty tall. But I think there's a misconception, because I think a lot of the trees that are shown probably are on the existing property, won't be there anymore. So, it's important to understand these conditions. If on the planning board, what I would typically ask for is a site section at some critical locations showing the existing grades and the proposed grades and how much of that is being changed. So what's being cut out or what's being added, the height of the wall, the height of the guardrail, just so it could be understood relative to the impacts on those adjacent properties.
Thank you, very helpful.
Mhm.
I don't have any further questions of the questions that the members had. Thank you to members of the planning board for your testimony. Appreciate your time and attention to this important matter. So thank you very much. Let me ask Mr. Zawinski. Tim, there's a couple of issues here that have come up with respect to engineering that I think it would be helpful to make sure that the town engineer is aware of and perhaps could speak to it, in particular the guardrail, the height of those walls, and the efficacy of that. I know that they're not public walls, but it might be helpful to hear from him on both of those issues.
I can certainly, I will have both the DPW director and the town engineer. I'll ask them to review this tape once it's up, and then I can chat with Mr. Gaius and Ms. Swenson offline and see if they can perhaps maybe put some of those questions and comments in writing, just so they can review in time for next week's testimony.
No, that's great. That's great. We'll look forward to getting the letter that will supplement the existing letters that we have on the file. Thank you very much. Do you have
And thank
anything
you, Chair. And
You're
I just wanted to thank you, Chair, and thank you, fellow zoning board members, for all of your time and late nights and all of your service to the town. Thank you.
You're welcome. Tim, do you have anything you'd like to add at this time?
Sorry, I was sending an email to myself to remind myself to do what I just said I would do.
All right.
So I had a hard time hitting my mute button. No, I'm all set for now, Mr. Chair. I may have some additional questions and comments next week when Mr. Berkeley and potentially Ms. Fernandez testify, but I'm all set for now.
Thank you. Mr. Schomer,
Yes, Mr. Chair.
do you have anything you'd like to add? Are you going to offer the board any testimony tonight, or did your previous remarks indicate that you'll be submitting something in writing and will be prepared to speak to that next week?
No further testimony from us tonight, Mr. Chair, although I would note that I was reminded by the testimony of Chair Swenson, the issue of tree protection plan. We will be submitting a tree protection plan with our updated materials later this week. And just further to say that we very much appreciate her comments and those of Ms. Tugayas. We have been following along with the proceedings of the planning board in regard to this project and the other ones that we're also proposing, and we have been listening to their feedback, and we very much appreciate it. We think it's resulted in some changes to the project that have improved it from all aspects. So thank you very much.
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of feedback on what we've heard, and it seems to me there's amongst the other issues, amongst the several issues that are in front of us, there are two issues that we return to again and again, and one is the construction management plan. I don't really care what we call it, but I feel like the applicant is asking the Board of Appeals to take a leap of faith. I understand the case, and I've heard you speak on this a couple of times, but it goes way beyond tree preservation. It goes to construction, um, access for fire trucks, and just simply, can this project be built on such a tight site? I don't know. And I don't think anybody's testified that it can be. And I think where the applicant has left the board is just saying, trust us. And it feels to me like it's got to be more than trust us. Maybe you can't produce a construction management plan that is stamped by a registered engineer and it's called a construction management plan. But there's some basic things that are out there that the town's peer reviewers, town officials, and the neighbors have returned to again and again. I don't want to propose a solution to this time, but I want to tell the applicant that, at least in my mind, this is a major issue with this application. That's point one. Point two, that we return to again and again is the massing. This site has a lot of stormwater issues, and through a lot of work, there has been a design proposed that is, by everybody's admission, complex. One reason why it's complex is the site is so big. The impervious soil, the impervious amount of impervious soil is being disrupted to the point where it's making it difficult to manage water on the site. I want to reinforce the point that was made by the planning board members tonight and by Mr. Bomer in the earlier meetings about doing everything you can to make this site smaller or to reduce its mass. Now, you testified, Mr. Schomer, that when you did that, you needed to add units to the roof because otherwise you would, the site would be uneconomic, almost forcing the board for you to prove that to us, which we can under the regulations. I'd rather not do that, given the amount of time that we've all spent on this. The last thing I think everybody wants to do is spend several more months working through the economics of this analysis, but we will do it if we have to. And I'd like you to work harder at finding a solution to adopt the recommendations, or to consider consider again the recommendations that have been made with respect to managing the footprint, just because it has multiple benefits that have been testified. And to me, we're going to need to get answers to those two pervasive questions before we can move to a conclusion of this hearing. And the third thing I want to say is I continue to be concerned about the offsite infrastructure, but I don't want to make a comment about that tonight because I was looking forward to hearing from Mr. Berkeley. So I feel like we need to run that issue to ground. But I think if you were to summarize the main thrust of the three issues of the hearings that we've talked about, I really feel like so many of the issues are captured in those three issues, which are make the site less dense to make it easier to manage stormwater, show us how this project is going to be built. Forget about the words construction management plan. We need more evidence. And thirdly, let's make sure we're addressing the offsite infrastructure. And with respect to that last issue, I want to reserve further comment on that pending hearing from Mr. Berkeley. So those are my thoughts. Let me ask the members of the board if they've got anything they'd like to share with the applicant at this time. No pressure to do so.
Nothing from me, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman, if I may,
Mr. O'Brien.
not in the spirit of piling on, but relative to the construction management plan, I know the applicant has been resistant to that and has specifically declined to provide one. And I will take your words from just a few moments ago. I don't care what you call it. Call it late for breakfast if you want to, but there are way too many practical details that are out there floating around for me. How are you going to get a crane in there? Where are people going to park? Where are the materials going to go? how is access to the site going to be maintained? It is a constrained site. And I don't want to be as gnarly as to say that the applicant needs to prove it to us or prove it to me, but I would urge the applicant that the applicant has to show something. And it has to be something that's substantive. There are a lot of practical issues here associated with such a constrained site. That, if anything, that's a lesson that we've learned through the master class that we've held over the past 20 weeks on sewage and drainage issues. So I would urge the applicant to reconsider their recalcitrance on that particular issue. And in terms of the other 2 points you made, I'll simply say I agree with you wholeheartedly, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Mr. Schumer, let me say, I feel like we've, having set up some time to hear from Mr. Berkeley, and he's not able to meet us, which is tonight. I think we may be at the end of the hearing, but I do want to mention, I think we're going to run out of time. And, next week, we're going to hear from you on, or from the applicant, I'm sorry, through you, on anything you'd like to share with us with respect to Mr. Hill's testimony. Point 1. Point 2 is I don't want to say small issues, but the combination of issues that you've got the list down and I don't. I didn't write it down because I knew that you did, and I know that you'll be making a submittal. And those are nevertheless important, including the issues that were raised a couple of times by Mr. McGrath. That's the second point. And I think we should hear from you on the waivers. We did that once before. I'd like to do that again with your revision. And then I'd like to hear from you on an extension of time to get a couple of more dates in. We're going to need to run this into August, it seems to me. And I don't, to the extent that people think they think I want to do that, I don't. I want to conclude this hearing, but we need to do it in an orderly fashion, and I think we may need that date. So I don't know that we need to ask that tonight because we've got a couple more dates on the calendar, and we'll continue to meet every Wednesday for as long as it takes. But I feel like after the time that everybody is committed to this, we need to end this in an orderly and reasonable fashion, and we need to reserve some time for the board to deliberate. So those are my thoughts.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just
Please.
a point of clarification on the point that you made about reducing the massing on the site. There's obviously been quite a bit of testimony on that, and we did present some alternative sketch plans. I believe it was 2 weeks ago, of some alternative layouts to shift around some of the massing on the site. I guess from our perspective at this point, Mr. Chair, when we're coming up, as I believe we're 2 weeks to at this point, close of the hearing, we're not getting a sense from the members if you're comfortable with the level of density we proposed, or the level of the unit count, frankly. And from our perspective, I think we need to get more of a sense from the members about whether this project, as you see it, is somewhere that's close, or somewhere that's miles away, in terms of whether this is something that you could be willing to approve.
Reasonable people will differ. I'm less concerned about the unit count. I recognize that the unit count has other issues like parking and bicycle storage and intensity of use concerns, which could affect the historic gardens, et cetera. But it feels to me like an overwhelming concern is to deal with the impervious area issue, because stormwater is the #1 issue in this project. So I would urge you to absorb the units in the building somehow, make them smaller, sharpen your pencil without making the building bigger. So that when you say, I've made the building higher, I don't know, that's a massing issue too. So, that was a suboptimal solution to me. And I feel like not you, Mr. Schumer, the applicant needs to work a little bit harder, perhaps with Mr. Bomer, on that issue. That's what I'm referring to.
Understood. And that's, I think that's the reason, Mr. Chair, why we brought those alternative layouts to your attention and wanted to show them to you, because I think our team reached a similar conclusion that they had drawbacks. Both of them did. There's been a lot of testimony about height and massing, and one of the alternatives would increase that. There's been a lot of testimony, obviously, about impervious surface and taking down trees. And the other alternative would increase impervious and take down additional trees.
Yeah.
So we can, I mean, we can certainly take another look at that. But I think for us to move forward with an additional significant change in the project, we would want to have a sense from the board members if this is a project that you're comfortable with, and this is moving in the direction of a conditioned approval. Because if you're, frankly, if the members are not comfortable with the project or are far away from being comfortable with the project at this point, from our perspective, it would be preferable to close the hearing and have a denial issued so we could move to the next step.
Yeah, we had 21 hearing dates, and I just gave you 3 pieces of detailed feedback. So I'll leave it to your conclusion as to whether or not you think we're getting closer to a point where we can deliberate this. I think we are, but if you don't think so, that's up to you. That's a judgment you have to make. Let me just make a comment about the trees. I have no idea if any tree will survive on this site. You have not showed us at all. You've showed us some drawings that show the trees have survived. I have no idea if this is why we need the plan to show that you can build it. I just think it's so fundamental. So, I mean, I'm not saying that the issues that I've articulated are not large. They are, but they are in the scheme of the issues that have been tackled in the 21 hearing dates we've had. They are as detailed as I think you can reasonably expect.
Understood.
I'll invite the members if they want to supplement my comments to Mr. Schomer on the point.
Chairman, I'm not going to supplement your comments. I'm going to associate myself with your comments.
Nothing further from me. Thank you.
Well, I would just say, Mr. Chair, this is food for thought for us, and we'll go back with our team in the next week and sharpen our pencils again. In the meantime, we will be filing some supplemental materials, as I mentioned, including a fairly comprehensive tree protection plan, incorporating a number of the points that Chair Swenson made in her remarks. So we hope that these are responsive to some of the information requests, if not all, to date. And we think that this has been a thorough, comprehensive permit process, and there's a lot of evidence in the record. And we're doing our best to try to convince the board members that this is a project that's right for the town of Milton and right for the site, and frankly a public good, and that it brings a lot of affordable housing that at this point is badly needed in the Milton housing market. So
yeah, and okay, fair enough. I'm not sure that we'll ever get to that point. Frankly, what we're trying to address is the local concern, consistent with the statute, and responding to what multiple people, town officials, residents, experts have testified are those local concerns. That's where my focus is. That's where the board's focus is. And that's what you're hearing from us about how this boils down. So I appreciate the point on food for thought. Let's make next hearing a robust one. We'll hear from Mr. Berkeley. We'll hear from you, Mr. Schomer. And unless there's further business for the Board of Appeals tonight, I'll recess this hearing till next Wednesday at 7 o'clock on the same Zoom channel. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.